Dan, are we good?
Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, we are good.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Town of Babylon Councilman Anthony Manetta, and today we're having our second Women in Business Leadership Forum. We had a great event last year, really highlighting women in business and leadership, and this event is so important, and it's a topic that the Town of Babylon and our Small Business Committee and Economic Development folks really strive for and really focus on. And I have co-hosting with me today our town clerk, Gerry Compitello. So thank you, Gerry, for joining and really promoting this important effort. We're really fortunate today that we have a dynamic leader for Long Island. She really makes a fantastic impact, not just on the educational community, but the business community also, by being able to provide her leadership skills and ability for Adelphi University. And on behalf of myself and Town Supervisor Rick Schaefer and the Town Board, we welcome you to this great event. I'm going to turn it over to our Town Clerk, Gerry, who's going to tell us a little bit about Dr. Riordan. And then we're going to have Dr. Riordan make a presentation, and we're looking forward to it.
Very good. Thank you, Anthony. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Christine Riordan, the 10th president of Adelphi University and the first woman to serve in that role in the institution's 125 years. She is an internationally recognized expert in leadership development, team building, diversity, and inclusion, and is well known for her groundbreaking work to personalize the higher education experience. She was appointed as the university's president and moved to Long Island with her family in 2015. Immediately, Dr. Riordan set about working with Adelphi's greater community to develop a strategic plan called Momentum and a vision for the university to become a globally recognized modern metropolitan university. Under her leadership, Adelphi's enrollment has risen by 10%. Its financial strength has been recognized by Standard & Poor's, and the university has admitted the 4 most diverse classes in its history. In the past 2 years, Adelphi was named a top U.S. college by Wall Street Journal, Times Higher Education College Rankings, ranked in the top 26% in the country in 2020. Also in 2020, Forbes once again placed Adelphi on its list of America's top colleges for student outcomes and career success. Dr. Riordan is currently the chairperson for the Commission on Independent Colleges and Universities in New York. It was this capacity that she co-chaired the task force on restarting higher education in response to COVID-19, through which she assisted in guiding approximately 235 colleges and universities in our state to reopen responsibly and safely. She is also currently the Secretary-Treasurer to the Long Island Regional Advisory Council on Higher Education. Dr. Riordan is also on the Board of Directors for the Long Island Association and co-chair of the Long Island Association's Women's Collaborative. For the past 4 years in a row, the Long Island Press has named Dr. Riordan one of the 50 most influential people on Long Island, and she was voted Best College President twice by Bethpage Best of Long Island Awards. Diverse Issues in Higher Education magazine named Dr. Riordan one of the 25 top women in higher education who are making a difference. We are excited to learn more about Dr. Riordan's professional success and how she helped lead Adelphi and higher education in New York through our most recent crisis and times of uncertainty. Please help me welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Christine Riordan. Welcome, Dr. Christine Riordan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here today, and thank you for hosting such a wonderful event and a meaningful event. I always am inspired when we can bring people together to talk about leadership. You know, as I was preparing for this today, I started reflecting on this past year, and literally it was 1 year ago on January 20th, 2020, when I first formed our initial crisis team at Adelphi in response to COVID-19. We had been watching the international landscape, and we knew that we had many students who were from China and also from the Wuhan area, and we were getting early signs that our students may not be able to return. Let me just give you a quick kind of fast track through this past year so you can kind of get a sense of the magnitude as well as the speed with which we worked. So January 20th, I formed our first crisis response team that started looking at how our international students were going to be impacted, whether we were going to be able to bring them back. By January 27th, I sent the first message to our campus about the emerging crisis, the worldwide crisis that was emerging. February 2nd was a travel ban, which then prevented many of our international students from returning. They had gone home during the semester break or the holiday break. We also initiated our university-wide business continuity planning. We accelerated that during the month of February, so every department was asked to figure out how they could operate remotely if we needed to do that. On February 24th, just a little over a month from when I initiated the first crisis response team, I elevated that team to the highest level of crisis or threat, which was a level 3 per our university standards. We laid out 6 overarching principles that were going to guide our response to this crisis. First and foremost, of course, was to maintain the public health and safety of all of the members of our community. We wanted to take measures that would help slow the spread of COVID-19. We wanted to mitigate the risk to the mission and to the operations of the university. We wanted to try to subvert any challenges that we had. And of course, we were thinking about, we were looking around the corner to see what might happen as we evolved through this crisis. On March 10th, I remember this day very well. I was in New York City. We made the decision to tell our students to go home and become remote. This was right before spring break. That announcement went out on March 10th. On March 11th, I formed our executive crisis team that began meeting every single day except Sundays. That continued through June, actually. On March 16th, we announced that our spring semester classes would be online for the rest of the semester. Around that same time, we canceled our spring athletics with the Northeast 10 conference, as well as through NCAA. By March 23rd, all of our campus personnel were 100% remote, with the exception of essential personnel like public safety. By April, we were still in the midst of our international crisis, our worldwide crisis. I formed our restart teams, believe it or not, looking ahead to when we would perhaps open again, hopefully in the fall, late August of the fall. At that same time, as was mentioned earlier, I was working with the Commission for Independent Colleges and Universities to look at restart for the state of New York. We gave the governor's office by May. In 1 month, we pulled together more than 100 private institutions, and we had a major task force to really look at how we could restart higher education. And by, I think, June, the guidance was issued from the state for higher education. Our teams continued to work through the summer. By the end of August, we safely reopened. And as I just shared with Councilman Manetta, we made it through our fall semester with a very low positivity rate of 1% or less throughout the entire semester. We reclosed at Thanksgiving, and now next week we are planning on reopening again in the spring. And this week we opened our brand new renovated University Center that, of course, continued construction even with a pandemic twist. So that is kind of the year in a very fast spiral. But interestingly enough, as I was sharing with the councilman earlier, one of the things that I was also doing was I was working on a book called Shift Happens: How to Adapt and Thrive in a Rapidly Changing World of Work. And I actually had to put it down as we went through this crisis, but many of the concepts apply. And I actually saw them unfolding as I was going through this crisis. So I thought what I could do today is to share a little bit of the principles that are associated with that book, and as they apply to crisis leadership. I do think that it's really important to understand how we respond to crises as people first, and foremost, and then also to really think about it as humans, as leaders. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, I'll get a head nod and make sure that's successful. Is that a successful share? All right. So, as you know, this book was really intended, what was not mentioned is for probably more than 20 years, I've worked as an executive coach with senior level executives throughout my entire career. Obviously, I've been in leadership roles and have a number of employees that I work with. I also serve on the board of directors for Remax Holdings and work with their executive team. But this book was really intended to think about how somebody could adapt and thrive as they're facing changes in their workplace. But a crisis in many cases is one of the major changes that you might face as you go through it. And this book was really intended to teach people to be their own career and job coach. Rather than having to call somebody like me in to help somebody adapt to the changes, I wanted to see if I could figure out a way to actually help them adapt and thrive as they move through these changes. But, as we think about the crisis situation that we're faced, it really is what I consider a unique type of a change that you might face in a workplace. It's what I call a shocking change. And there's a couple of elements associated with a shocking change. Typically, it's unplanned. So in the case of us, we've probably all lived through several shocks, major shocks as a country, as a state. Certainly we had Hurricane Sandy. That was a shock, I think, for many of us here on Long Island and in the state of New York. We also had 9/11, which was a major shock worldwide. And of course, this worldwide pandemic has been a shock that impacted everyone. You can also go through shocks just personally. You could have, where people are laid off. I think many of our companies have gone through that. So people are layering on the types of shocks that have existed during this pandemic, or you have something that happens to you personally. And we know that we've had many people impacted through deaths with COVID-19 or through illnesses in their families. Typically, when you go through a shock, it's unplanned. It's not in your control. And in many cases, it's a very large change that you have to go through. And as I always say, it's like the shift just got real, very fast and very quick, which is what happened with us. When you think about crisis leadership, again, I say you have to think about it from yourself first, because you are a person and you're going to have reactions to the changes that are going on into the crisis. And at the same time, you'll be leading others. And it's important to really think about, I'm going to just share just two of the psychological concepts that go along with change and adapting. The first is really how we make sense of changes that we might face. And I call this the think, feel, do spiral. And it's really important to consider how you are reacting and making sense of a crisis. So one thing that you can do right now is to really think about what was your reaction as this crisis was starting to unfold, and as we started learning more about the pandemic. Typically, when we go through shocks, common responses are fear. We don't know what it is. It makes us afraid. We're afraid for our health. We're afraid for our families. We're afraid for our community. We often have anger and we're upset. And so a lot of times when we're in a shock situation, I always say it's think, feel, do, but oftentimes it's feel, do, think. So it's not always in that linear order. And we don't go through this just one time. It's just a spiral. It continues to go through. And as you are going through something like a crisis, you're constantly trying to make sense of what's happening. And as a leader, you're really trying to make sense of what's happening for not just yourself, but then also for your organization. And you have to start moving into that action mode very, very quickly as a leader, which I'll talk about shortly. But it's super important for all of us to know that we're all going through this sense-making process together. And it's also very important to understand that everyone is different in how they process and make sense of crises. And that's important for us to remember. So that's kind of the first, what I call psychological concept that's really important for us to keep in mind as we go through crises together. The second psychological concept is this concept of fit or misfit. So we were all probably ticking along in January of 2020 in our jobs and our lives. We had everything worked out. Maybe we were happy in our jobs, kind of feeling like everything fit. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. So in my case at the university, by March 23rd, we were 100% remote with the exception of our public safety personnel, as well as some of our facilities and maintenance personnel on campus. Everybody was operating under a new business continuity plan. We had to change all of our operations, including all of our classes, to 100% online. And, a lot of times people don't choose to work remotely because they want to be around with their colleagues. So everything shifted for everybody. In many cases, our employees were faced with managing their children being home from school. You can see this photo on the left is me, and you might even be hearing her, my dog, Georgia. I kind of took over her space and she snores. She's snoring right now in the background as we go through these Zoom calls. And this was one of the executive crisis meetings that we were having that we had every single day remotely, like I said, through June. But what happens is a lot of times the feelings that you have when you're in a misfit situation also impact, how you're feeling about that type of a situation. So everything changed for everybody at the same time. And you have to understand that causes stress as well, for all of us, to be 100% remote. For me, in cases, I'm going to just kind of say this tongue in cheek, but I also realized in this situation, you can see me in a flannel shirt and some jeans, but I had very few casual clothes. And so all of a sudden I'm thinking I only have suits, but I haven't worn my wedding band in probably a year because I'm with my husband all the time, at home. I didn't need to do that. But at the same time, I had two college age kids. One of my son was able to come home from Philadelphia. My daughter was a senior in college and she was not able to come home. She was in the St. Louis area until May. So there was the stress of being a parent and worrying about the safety of my children and managing them, having them in the household while I was also working and running the university. And I'm sure many of you felt that same way. And you had to adjust very quickly. We all had to adjust. So those are what I call two really important psychological processes that underlie any kind of adaptation or change is how you're making sense of a situation. And then also if it's a misfit situation, if you're shifted and you're in a misfit situation, how you try to bring yourself back into alignment so you have a greater sense and a feeling of fit. So very quickly, in a crisis situation, it's very important to then start laying out your plan. And I realized very quickly, as I was interacting with our community, the first communication went out in January of 27. And just to give you a little bit of background about Adelphi, at that time we had around 8,100 students. I had more than 2,000 employees, faculty and staff, that full-time and part-time. We have more than 116,000 alumni that are worldwide. So it's a very large operation. I've got 4 different locations. Garden City is our main campus, but I also have a location in Hudson Valley area and Hauppauge, and then also in Manhattan. So it's a diverse community with a lot of different needs. And I realized very quickly what they wanted was guidance. They wanted information. And it reminded me of an exercise that I used to do when I was teaching executive MBA students around strategic thinking. I would give them a puzzle, and it was a child's puzzle. Typically it was targeted towards kids that were around 11 years old. And it was typically like a black cat or a green frog or something to that effect. But I would do something, I would take the edges away, and I wouldn't give them the box with the picture of the puzzle on it. I would just give them a baggie with the interior puzzle pieces that typically were all the same color. And a puzzle that would have normally taken them like 5 minutes to solve, 2 or 3 of these executives would take them anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes. And a lot of times they would dump it out and I could see them sorting the puzzle pieces and they'd be looking for the edges, and then a couple times they would say, hey, can you give us the box cover? And I'd be like, no. And part of the exercise with them was to say, when we're going through, strategy and issues that we have to start thinking very creatively and differently. We have to start thinking about how we're going to solve a puzzle in a different way than putting the edges together and then also looking at the picture on the box. And what it dawned on me is that with this pandemic, we were solving a puzzle without the edges and without the picture of what it was going to look like in the end game. But what most people craved were the edges and the picture of what it was going to look like. So from a leadership standpoint, I think, as you're going through your own emotional reactions and how you're thinking and feeling and doing, it's also really important to recognize that in a crisis situation, more than anything else, I think everyone else within your organization is they're craving those edges and they're craving what that picture is going to look like. You may remember, of course, Governor Cuomo was having his daily news conferences, and they became not only well recognized here in the state of New York, but also nationally. And it was because so many people were craving information, even if it was just to say, we don't have anything new. It was just that sense of somebody's on top of it, somebody's starting to try to give me a couple of those edge pieces, or at least a better picture of what's going on. And that is why many of his news conferences were so important, because of that deep desire to really try to understand what's happening. We still are operating with a puzzle that doesn't have all of the edges complete. We have a lot more of it, and it continues to evolve. But this is probably the biggest thing to consider. So just kind of quickly, I won't go through these in detail, but as you think about crisis leadership, of course, you're moving very quickly through a process, very, very quickly. You're assessing the situation. And as I mentioned before, I started assessing this situation in January. And I don't have to say that our threat response team was fairly relaxed in January, and then by February 24th, it was starting to amp up, and we were starting to do some really fast scenario planning. Our public safety team, which is quite skilled in emergency management, started taking our teams through emergency responses as it relates to a pandemic. It's also very important to reinforce your values. As I mentioned, we laid out 6 different principles by which we're going to form our crisis response at all times, with the health and safety of our community being number one, and then also making sure that we were doing our part to help stop the spread of COVID-19. It's also very important to go ahead and pull your team together. And what's interesting here is that oftentimes, again, because people are adapting, and they're going to adapt at different rates and with different capabilities, because they're still going through that feel, think, feel, do cycle themselves. You often find differences in who is stepping up to the plate in a crisis situation than who is typically leading, I think, in a normal situation. I think one of the news conferences that the governor was holding, he said he was surprised at, on his team, who actually stepped up and who wasn't able to step up. And, I think all of us probably experienced that. And at the same time, you have to remember that people are going through those emotional, it's not anything that you hold against anyone if they're not able to step up, because they're also going through those emotional, perhaps traumas, as we're going through various crisis situations. So what you're really looking for is people that can adapt very quickly. As an organization, you have to adapt very quickly. Like I said, we moved from 100% in person to 100% remote from March 10th all the way to March 23rd, 100% remote. And you have to be, as a leader, you're trying to be very decisive and take action as quickly as you can. And you're going to get it right some of the time, and you're not going to get it right some of the time. And that's okay. You have to understand that. And all you're doing, I can't say, I couldn't fit it on here, but I would say just communicate, 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 communicate. We held many town halls, open forums, conversations, not just while the crisis was going on, but also as we were developing the restart plans. We developed all kinds of online web material. We set up a separate email account that people could contact us with, and we're trying to respond within 24 hours, understanding again, kind of that psychology of everybody just wants some of the edges and they want what the picture is. And then it's just a constant situation while you're going through it. You just have to keep going through and assessing it. What is important to remember, though, is at some point you have to also recognize that you need to look forward, that you can't just stay what I call in a constant crisis mode. So in our situation, we started thinking about rebuilding, right, or restarting in April. So we're still at the midst of the crisis and at the height of it here in New York, but we did have our team start looking at it, both at Adelphi and then for the state of New York for higher education. And that does a couple of things. I think it helps move people out of, a negative spiral associated with a crisis. We're providing some hope and some guidance that perhaps we can get back to a normal or semi-normal situation as we had it, but also recognizing that we're still managing both things at the same time, the crisis response as well as just starting to plan for the future. In our situation now, because we have gotten the restart down pretty well, we're now also starting to plan for fall of 21 and looking forward to kind of a multi-year recovery within higher education as a response to the pandemic. One of the things that I found when I was working on this book and through my 20 years of executive coaching and just the research, the actual academic research and practitioner research that I've done, is that there are some characteristics that what I call the secrets of the successful adapters have, that there seem to be some characteristics that as people and as leaders, it's important to keep in mind and think about whether we can develop them. As I mentioned before, as I was forming my team, there were some people that could just immediately adapt and others it took them a longer time to kind of get through the crisis situation. And I think some people are just now starting to come back to what is normal because they've adapted into that situation that was previously a very much of a misfit for them. But I was always curious, over the past many years when I was working with executives, why some people seem to thrive amidst change and why they could adapt very well in a crisis situation or just in a normal change situation. And so I call these the secrets of successful shifters or successful adapters. And I want to just highlight a few of these for you, and then I will open it up, I think, for question and answers. I love this quote: when something goes wrong in life, just yell plot twist and move on. It's an anonymous quote, but I think as I interviewed so many people who were successful at enduring what I would even call tragic seismic shocks in their lives, this seemed to be something that they embraced, is that, okay, this happened and now we're going to move on. I always say to people that, the first thing to keep in mind is that any kind of change, and particularly in a crisis situation, it's messy. It's just messy. There's nothing linear about it. There's nothing usually pretty about it necessarily. And you just have to kind of embrace that and be okay with, how hard something may be, how difficult it may be, or sometimes you feel like you take 3 steps forward and then 4 steps back. That just understanding that, not getting frustrated with it, and just understanding that it's messy and kind of accepting that has been a strong characteristic for people who are extraordinarily resilient and good at adapting and leading even in the face of a crisis. The other one is seeing opportunity in the change. So for us, what was great about our shift at Adelphi was, I think our entire community learned so many things during this. And as we're planning for 2021 and, for the next year, 21-22, it's wonderful to hear everybody talking about, well, here's the lessons that we've learned from having to go 100% remote. And here's how our students really want to learn. And here's some things that we can be doing. And so virtually, there is not going back to the way we were. Everything is going to be changed, but for the positive, because we were able to learn from this situation. And so I think many of our departments, many of our units, many of our programs kind of saw this as an opportunity to really rethink curriculum, to rethink how we did our day-to-day operations, and how we can best serve our families and our students. So another secret of successful adapters is that they do see opportunity within changes that are presented to them. The third one, as I had just mentioned before, is that anytime you are going through changes, you also have to kind of be looking around the corner and considering about what's happening in the future. So as I'd mentioned earlier, I was already plodding along, not just to get through the crisis, but okay, how are we going to get through the recovery while we're still managing it? And that's a characteristic and a trait that I've seen in a lot of very successful leaders and adapters, is that they're always thinking about the future, even while they're managing the current changes that they're going through. It is super important to have courage to change. I can't say that every single decision that we have made at the university, and ultimately I have made at the university since I am the president, has been popular. The most recent one that received a lot of pushback, of course, was canceling spring break and moving those days, spreading them out through the semester. And that was done for public safety reasons. I think many universities have moved to that model. But anytime the students go away, it makes it very difficult to come back and to control possible positivity rates. So we've had a full-blown public health safety team that's been working with us, and we're lucky to have some experts on our faculty. But the decisions are hard. And as I sat with all of our Northeast 10 presidents at the universities, we've now had multiple meetings. Making the decision to cancel our athletics has just been heartbreaking and heart-wrenching for all of us, because we know our student athletes so look forward to their play. But again, in the public health interest, we knew that was the right thing to do. And so you do have to have the courage to change, make very hard decisions, perhaps make decisions that are unpopular, and even have the courage to change yourself, I would say, in many cases. We all need to have our stamina for change. I do think that people who are very successful in leading crises make sure that they are taking care of themselves, and that they understand that the change is not going to occur, or perhaps the issue is not going to be resolved in one day. And so they understand that it's a long-term thing, and they take care of themselves and have that emotional fortitude, I think, to manage really high levels of stress and change. We've probably all started some habits. I don't think I've worn shoes for almost a year. I feel like I'm in socks and slippers. I'm not sure I could ever go back to it when I start going back to campus regularly. I go on walks almost every evening, and get up and walk around, have laughs and those sort of things. But it's just understanding that changes typically are for the long haul, and you've got to make sure that you've got the stamina. And then I would say, finally, the biggest characteristic of many of the successful adapters is that they are self-reflective during the change. And this is really a lot of the emotional intelligence, I think, that goes along with successful leadership, is understanding yourself, understanding how you need to change, how you're feeling, what your think, feel, do cycle is looking like at any particular moment. And then also understanding when you need to be different, and having that self-awareness to make those changes yourself. So these are, very quickly, I know that I could probably spend hours with all of you in terms of talking about leading crisis and adapting and thriving throughout change. But I hope if there's anything that you remember when something does go wrong in life, just yell plot twist and think about how you need to move on. So thank you. And I think now I will open it up for questions.
Yeah, that was amazing. What a fantastic presentation. And what was awesome about that is that it really transcends across all industries and sectors. And it's the information there is spot on. I mean, just from your perspective, I mean, I didn't really I knew Adelphi was a large institution, but a combined 10,000 students and employees is a massive, massive organization.
Yes.
So you must have been, and still are, but especially in the early days, under an immense amount of stress, and, whether it be, student body to curriculum, to employees, to health and wellness, safety, mental health, and the big one, which, you're running a business is the financial stress.
Yes.
I mean, just how did you manage through that? I mean, is I guess employing some of the tips you just went through in the presentation, but how are you managing through that?
Yeah, how do you prioritize that?
Yeah.
That was going to be my question, Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, we were, like I said, because I had gone through many tabletop exercises throughout my career in higher ed in response to a pandemic. So you can do the scenario planning, and we've got a great emergency management response team, and we commonly take our leadership, our managers within the university through that kind of response. But we couldn't have planned for, I mean, we planned for it, but it never rolls out the way that you plan for it. So you have to be really quick and understand that you're adapting. The big thing for us was putting together the various teams. So as soon as I escalated it up to what I call the highest level of threat assessment, and we started meeting on a daily basis, literally we'd spend 2 hours every morning from like 8 to 10 as a group of executives with our emergency management executives as well, talking through all of the different issues. And we started just kind of going through, and it really was a matter of prioritizing, but I couldn't do it alone. I mean, it certainly wasn't just 3 or 4 people. We had our executive crisis team, but we also had our crisis response team. But like I said, very quickly in April, I started forming sub-teams. So I had an HR sub-team, I had a financial sub-team, I had a public health and safety sub-team, and gave them charges. And we were checking in with them every day, continuing to engage the people that were, understanding all the operations. And so we had multiple teams that were working on a daily basis to kind of lay out the priorities. And then all of those were surfaced up to the executives for us to make decisions very quickly. You did mention there was a financial impact sending the students home. Of course, we refunded all of the residence halls, and dining, of course, was associated with that. And then I was needing to engage our board, in terms of some of the financial decisions and how we're going to manage the financial crisis. So I did have a very, very active financial team. And then we also had a team that I had formed in terms of actually trying to look for recovery dollars. So the first thing that we did was to see if we could work through our insurance policy for business recovery. That was denied, by the way. But we did then start looking at the various grants that were going to be available and whether we could do something through FEMA, as well as through, of course, now the CARES Act came out. So we did have an active team that was working on that. But we redeployed people through the crisis and asked people to shift out of their kind of day-to-day jobs, and also to then start working on some of the things that were going to help us with the recovery. But I would say it was, I actually had to put down writing the book because it was, working pretty much almost, 18 to 20 hours sometimes a day on some of these issues and just organizing it. I have to say, though, that one of the things that I was the most proud of and pleased with is the level of collaboration that I saw on our campus in response to the issues. And then also within the state, for the New York State response, we had a team of probably more than 100 presidents and provosts that were actively working. We had sub-teams on that as well to help provide our response and help each other, because more than anything, we wanted all of our institutions to open up safely, because that was good for our students, for our community, and for the state.
So what do you feel like, probably your biggest challenge was during this pandemic in terms of leading the university?
I think really, and people would probably, I don't know what grade I would give us in terms of, but I think communication with so many different people was always a challenge, and having to keep it top of mind and making sure that we were constantly communicating. Like I said, people wanted the edges, they wanted the puzzle picture, couldn't always give it. So just being really honest in the communication, pulling everything together. As we were pulling together the restart, we're basically like a mini city. So we have restaurants with our dining facilities. We have hotels with our residence halls. We have sports teams with our athletics. We have gyms. We have retail with our bookstore. we have religious organizations with our interfaith chapel. We have transportation with our buses and public safety. And so we had to comply not only with the higher ed guidance, but we had to comply with the guidance for every single one of those categories in our restart plans. So pulling all of those sub restart plans together, we have gyms, we have an early learning center, a child care center on campus. So every single one of those have their own separate restart plans that were in accordance with state guidance, but then communicating that out. So, it in essence was restarting a city, I think in many cases for us, and understanding all the guidelines and then making sure that we were communicating that and being very clear, I think was a challenge. I think we did okay. I think we did really well compared with a lot of other organizations, but you always feel like you could do more in that regard.
Yeah, and I feel, early on in the pandemic, like one of the talking points that I had with my colleagues in the town was like, we need to be the official communicator of the right information.
Correct.
There's so much disinformation going around social media and text messages. I heard this, I heard that. It was really important, and still to this day, that, you're putting out the right factual information.
Yes.
And, especially, from my perspective, really working as the point person with the business community, that was, even critical. When can you open? Can you open? What's an essential business?
Yes.
What loans are available? How does it work? What's forgivable? What's not? I need money. Like it's just, and again, you can get really, as a business owner, just like if you were an employee or a student, you really can get your head spinning, not getting the right information. So, and I agree with you said about the governor. I mean, his communications and his daily communications were, an outlet for people to not only get the proper information, but, as a part of the mental health break,
Yes.
To be like, I'm talking with somebody, I'm listening, person is an authoritative figure telling me what's going on, might not have much to say, or you might have a lot to say. And yeah, I think that's such a critical piece and component to it for sure. No doubt about it.
I mean, we actually have right after this, we have an open town hall for just to have conversations with our public health team in the university about vaccines and availability and that sort of thing. We don't control any of that. It's controlled by the state, but we do have people that are constantly in communication with the Nassau County Public Health Department, as well as with the state, and, are experts in this area. And so again, just another forum to allow our community to ask questions and to give them the information that we have at this particular time. And we'll continue to do those types of things. But that to me is the biggest need and also the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and I think it's also important too, not to sound, Pollyanna, but, to always try and have some level of positivity
Yes.
to a message, right?
Yes.
Is to, I think, having hope and having a positive outlook, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel,
Yes.
that we are working towards, in-person classes at some point,
Yes.
it's not automatically going to be 2 or 3 years from now. We're going to do everything
Yes.
we can if the guidance allows us to, to get back to some sense of normalcy.
Yes.
So along those lines, come September, you're going to be starting a new freshman class with students who have been in and out of quarantine, remote learning, who's not remote learning for a year and a half.
Yes.
Do you think that that's going to impact like the way you're going to be doing things and learning, or, teaching, learning? It's just going to be so different. You're going to be dealing with such a different element of student come September, because every
Yes.
high school is doing things differently.
Yes. It's interesting. I do suspect that we'll have a little bit of a boomerang effect, because I think people are going to be so anxious to come back together and to hang out and things like that. I do think for, our undergraduate students in particular, having that experience on campus and hanging out, it's not just about going to class. It's actually all the co-curricular activities and friendships and other things that are a big part of it. So I do expect when we can safely come back together that we're going to see a lot of people wanting to kind of be engaged at that level. But as you mentioned, I do think that our portfolio of how we do classes is going to forevermore be changed. You know, we have completely rethought how we're doing summer classes as an example. So I think we'll have a lot more online classes, evening classes, but that's a good thing because it allows our students to do internships. And if they want to take a catch-up class, we changed the tuition model for the summer as well, so they can take classes a little bit less expensively than during the year. We also are welcoming people who are outside of the area. So I do think, you know, it's changing how we completely revamp it. We've completely revamped how we do our orientation. Last year was 100% online. This year, we're hoping at least to have a portion of in-person orientation, again, for that, what I would call that social component and that human connection. The reality is that I do think as we've gone through this, we've learned a lot about being remote and online and things that we do extraordinarily well and how we can leverage it more effectively. But I think in many cases, many people do want to have that human connection. And we do have a lot of majors that cannot necessarily do it online, though they were super creative. So our dance faculty, as an example, I watched them giving dance lessons via Zoom. You know, it was fantastic during the spring semester, but it was great when we were able to bring them back and do things in a socially distanced way. Same thing with art, our nursing, and, you know, some of the healthcare have to do their clinical rotations and things like that. So there are pieces that we've learned a lot. And I do know that I think our community wants a really big party when we can all come back together. I'm just looking forward to being able to host graduation because we've not been able to celebrate our 2020 grads, and it's unlikely. We'll probably push the 2021 a little bit out for later in the summer, just, you know, as we're starting to read the tea leaves about when it's going to be safe for us to gather large crowds.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Dr. Riordan, you have any closing thoughts you want to share?
No, I just want to thank you again for having me part of this Women's Leadership Conference. And, you know, I think that what you're doing to bring the community together and have conversations like this is fantastic. And I'm just happy to support it. And I want to wish everybody good luck in how they're adapting and just kind of remembering that shift does happen. And the more that we can focus on how we adapt and thrive and focus on yourself first, and then focus on your community and lean on each other. I just say, I think that's one of the biggest lessons. And I think joys of going through this pandemic is how much we have come together as a community. So thank you for continuing to foster these relationships.
You're welcome. And thank you, you know, very much for joining us. And I will say, definitely, you know, pick up that pen again and finish that book because this was amazing. It's an amazing presentation and you have so much to share. And I'm certain that there's organizations not only across New York State, but across, you know, the country that would really benefit from your leadership ability and what you have to teach. So thank you for that. And thank you as well for, you know, for leading the organization, Adelphi, and your 10,000 employees and students. And I'm sure, you know, many of which, you know, reside within the town of Babylon.
Yes.
So not only for your leadership for Adelphi, but for Long Island in general, because you truly are one of the best leaders that we have out there, and we're happy to have you. So thank you for your continued effort and your work. And Gerry, if you have anything you want to add.
No, thank you so much. I will say though, 2 years in a row, I did have interns in my office from Adelphi.
Oh, good.
Still keep in touch with them, and they were absolutely bright, wonderful, and on top of things. So I look forward to having interns when we can have them again from Adelphi in the future.
Thank you so much for supporting our students. That's fantastic. And thank you both for your kind comments.
All right, great. Thank you. And thanks everybody for watching. We will have this on YouTube as well, a copy. So we could, if you missed it, you could certainly watch it then. Thank you.